All right, we'll get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us for tonight's One State, One Film. I'm Nana Amos from Dodd Human Rights Impact at UConn. I am here with about 12 different organizations, and we're going to advance this slide so that you can see who the organizations are. And with these organizations, we formed the Connecticut Collaborative on Poverty, Criminal Justice, and Race. Our aim is to focus on work that fills gaps in what lots of other great organizations are doing on creating positive change throughout the community. You can learn more about this work by visiting ctcollaborativeinfo.org. One State, One Film is an ongoing collaboration with community stakeholders where we use the power of film to shed light on the intersection of poverty, criminal justice, and race. We do this by bringing together a diverse and insightful panel and moderator to share their perspectives and participate in thought-provoking conversation. Tonight, we're focusing on the film The Prison Within as our vehicle to highlight restorative justice and reimagining our criminal justice system. I hope you had a chance to view this powerful film that exposes the devastating impact untreated trauma has on individuals and communities through stories of survivors of violent crimes and those incarcerated for murder in San Quentin Prison. The incarcerated and survivors come together and participate in the Victim Offender Education Group, an innovative restorative justice program enabling offenders to discover how the trauma they've experienced contributed to their criminality and to understand the impact their crimes have on their victims. Together, perpetrators and survivors confront and expose the pain, shame, and rage caused by the extreme trauma they've experienced throughout their lives. We believe that if the criminal justice system was more rehabilitative, more transformative, more restorative in its approach, the brutality we often see in our TV screens would be few and far between. Our moderator this evening is Merle McGee. Merle is the president and CEO of Everyday Democracy, a capacity building organization based in Hartford that uses dialogue and action to foster a multiracial democracy by engaging and uplifting everyday people to power local democracies across the nation. Merle, thank you so much for agreeing to serve as moderator. In a few minutes, Merle will introduce our panelists and start the conversation. There will be time later in the event for you to ask questions. Please use the chat or the Q&A features to submit your questions. Later in the evening, we'll share a resource document. It includes links to documents and websites, films, and other resources that may be helpful to you as you consider how you can take action and/or get more involved with restorative justice after tonight. At the end of the event, we'll share with you a survey link about tonight's program. We'd really appreciate it if you fill it out because it will impact future events. And finally, we will be leaving the Zoom call open for a little bit after the formal program ends for those who may want to continue talking informally. So before we begin, we'd like to take a few minutes to center ourselves. We recognize that it has been a very long day for many of us, and that these issues can be difficult to talk about, and that many people have had traumatic experiences. We thank Dr. Amber Kelly in advance for helping us to get to a good starting point for our conversation this evening. I'll turn it over to Amber, and then we will begin the conversation. Thanks again for coming tonight.
Thank you, Nana. So I just want to welcome everyone and invite you to fully arrive in this moment, this time, this space. So taking a deep breath into your belly and finding a spot for your eyes to rest just for this moment. Nothing special about that spot, just somewhere for your eyes to be while you give focus to other ways that you're showing up right now. So allowing every moment that you experienced before this moment to be earlier today, earlier this week, earlier this month, earlier this lifetime, just letting it be and being here, fully arriving now. So taking a deep breath into the belly and dropping in and noticing, how am I showing up right now? Noticing your body in this moment. What are the physical sensations that call your attention? Sensations in the belly and the chest, and the back and the legs, and the arms and the head. What are the emotions that call your attention, and how are they showing up in the body? And taking another deep breath, just noticing your mind in this moment. Is it racing or still? Is it listening or giving you opinions? Is it remembering, planning, thinking, analyzing, or is it just hearing, experiencing? Is it doing some of all of those things? What are the thoughts moving through your mind in this moment? And can you find a way to allow them and let them be so you can be fully here? Taking another deep breath into the belly, just allowing, I'm showing up for this conversation, exactly what's going on right here, right now. And noticing how I'm showing up to be present for this conversation, for this opportunity to share this moment, time, and space with these people. And bringing to mind, when I think of restorative justice, restorative practices, what it means to restore, what comes up? What fears? What hopes? What suspicions? What wishes? And allowing all of these, holding these in mind and heart and body as we start this discussion together. Dropping in when you feel the need. Noticing the breath. Noticing how the feet are feeling the shoes. When you feel the need to get back present because some thought has taken you off on some journey. And just centering as we move through this discussion. And so taking one final breath and just allowing yourself to be welcomed into this space and this time. Thank you.
He, in cold blood, gunned down my husband and then stood over him and kept shooting.
I did come to prison because I did something terrible. I killed somebody.
I am only and just a murderer.
I was an instrument of destruction.
I am a conservative hardliner. I got the death penalty. I got what I wanted. Nothing changed. I didn't feel better. It didn't work.
Coming to San Quentin, though, is actually what put everything in perspective.
It's really about being on a journey together to connect the dots of their lives that led to a crime, to walk deeply and profoundly in accountability.
I'm sorry for taking your son.
In the way that you allow survivors to come in and say what we need to say, I can't even begin to quantify how healing that has been for me. It's how this system should work.
Do you want him to remain on death row?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Hurt people, and we've been hurting each other forever. It's time for change.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to serve as tonight's moderator. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists, and we'll drop their full bios and websites into the chat as we do that. Our first guest is Mr. Troy Williams. Mr. Williams may look familiar because he was featured in The Prison Within. He is the founder of Troy Williams Production and the nonprofit Restorative Media. And he works to develop transformative stories for social change. While incarcerated in San Quentin State Prison, Mr. Williams co-organized restorative justice symposiums, health fairs, job fairs, and numerous self-help workshops, as well as initiated the efforts to have a TEDx San Quentin prior to his parole. Upon his release, after serving 18 years of a life sentence, he continues to act as a liaison between inmates, volunteers, community organizations, prison administrators, and outside media organizations. Under his leadership as executive director of San Quentin's Restorative Justice Roundtable, prisoner participation grew from less than 40 to more than 200. Welcome, Mr. Troy Williams.
Hello, how you doing?
Our next guest and panelist this evening is State Senator Gary Winfield. Prior to his time in the state Senate, Mr. Senator Winfield served an unprecedented 3 terms in the Connecticut House of Representatives, marked by the passage of the state's repeal of the death penalty, a transgender civil rights bill, and an education equity and campaign finance reform legislation. As a state senator, Senator Winfield has been an instrumental leader in helping to reshape conversations surrounding criminal justice, juvenile justice, and immigration policy. Senator Winfield has written and championed numerous legislation aimed at reducing police use of force, including requiring the operation of body cameras and cultural competency training for all officers. He also led passage of legislation to raise the age at which juvenile arrestees could be tried as adults. The senator continues to work tirelessly to improve community relationships with the law enforcement and to fortify trust in the state's criminal justice system. And our senator will be joining us shortly, as we believe he is held up currently in the course of giving legislative agenda. But we welcome the senator to the space. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Amber Kelly. She is an associate professor of social work within the Quinnipiac University School for Health Services. Her work focuses on the use of using trauma-informed clinical work and contemplative practices with survivors of both interpersonal and systemic violence, with a specific focus on working with currently and formerly incarcerated people. She teaches trauma-informed and mindfulness-based classes within the Connecticut prison system and maintains a private practice working with survivors of violence as well. And we thank you and welcome you, Dr. Kelly, to the panel this evening. And finally, I am pleased to introduce New Haven native and author Nicholas Dawidoff. His 6th book, The Other Side of Prospect, a story of violence, injustice, and the American city, chronicles inequality, race, class, and violence, and what it reveals about the enduring legacies of social and economic disparities. Told through intersecting stories, The Other Side of Prospect delves into a hasty police investigation following a murder, which culminates with an innocent 16-year-old Bobby being sentenced to prison for 38 years. After years in prison, Bobby is finally set free. The book chronicles his subsequent struggles with the memories of prison and his heartbreaking efforts to reconnect with his family and community. And they exemplify the challenges the formerly incarcerated face upon re-entry into society, and provides a sweeping account of how the injustices of racism and inequality reverberate through and across the generations. Welcome, Mr. Dawidoff.
Thank you.
And so we're going to begin our panel discussion this evening. I'd first like to acknowledge that the film, The Power Within, The Prison Within, was incredible and incredibly moving. And perhaps even my faux pas, The Power Within, also would be a sub-narrative of the film itself. I was struck by the power of the words, of power of words to indict and to heal, the power of words to connect, and the power of connection to be harmful and healing, and the power of systems to traumatize and to heal. What we heard throughout the film is that the current mechanisms offered may provide punishment, but they do little to transform or heal survivors of crime, nor those who have created harm in folks' lives. And so what we'd like to begin this conversation with is really understanding the power of narrative justice, which is giving individuals, particularly those from marginalized communities, the power to tell their own stories in their own words. And so, Mr. Williams, I turn to you first to open this panel in reflecting on the following. How are you using restorative justice to discuss the structural effects of crime, criminalization, prison, and reintegration? And how is the use of narrative and dialogue available to address and transform the lives of those parties responsible for causing harm, survivors of harm, and those impacted by the results of the harm that has occurred?
Ooh, that's a big question. I will say that, for a very long time, I kept diving between the world of restorative practices and film and media, producing audio programs. And I really began to reflect on my own life. And you won't find many guys my age that wouldn't take you to the film Scarface and point to you how certain influences impacted our community, right? And I know a lot of times people don't like to think that movies or films impact, but in the recent report that came out, they said that because of Top Gun Maverick, recruitment for Air Force pilots was up 519%, right? And so definitely, film has an impact, dialogue has an impact. And if the only dialogue or only film or the only major sources of how we receive information is often negative, is often very disenfranchising on so many different ways. One, because of how the narratives are conducted, and two, because of who constructs the narrative, right? And so I have sought to, show, or even myself, to first learn how to rewrite my own narrative, how to write the narrative that speaks to my community in a way that academia can't speak to my community, not on the level that I'm trying to talk from, right? And so I just think it's important that we construct a dialogue, we construct a narrative about how we can maneuver it in our community. What does it mean to be successful? We're often touted sports and sports figures, but we actually have, more doctors and lawyers in our communities than we actually have sports figures. But that's not the data that's shown or the data that's talked about, publicly. So how do we bring, a different narrative to our community that can reach our community in a way that that we have not been very successful at doing in the past. So I know it was probably other pieces to the question, but I think I'll leave it at that for now.
I deeply appreciate your response, Mr. Williams, because it really does speak to the power of individuals to craft and tell their own stories, and how that has a transformational effect when one is presented with another narrative. And we avoid the single story.
Exactly. I just wanted to add one more thing too that was powerful about the narrative about the film, because typically you would think that every time there's a victim or somebody who has been a survivor of crime, or what we often identify as a victim first, nobody identifies the person who committed the crime as somebody who has been victimized by crime in and of themselves before. Second, we often assume that the survivor just wants revenge and wants rage and wants this person, but you clearly see from the movie, for the, everybody who watched it, that even after that happened, even after she got what she wanted and got this person to death row, it didn't really solve that. It didn't bridge that human connection that I think we all long for, and that's the power of films like this. And that's the power of being able to produce films within a setting such as San Quentin, who traditionally has only gotten very negative, feedback from media.
No, I appreciate you continuing the thread of that question and your response, and it really allows us to sort of pivot. You highlighted some pieces that we thought would be important to delve into a little bit more in our discussion tonight. And one of those things is that we heard echo throughout the film that there was a deep connection between intergenerational trauma, generational trauma, and violence, or more succinctly said, hurt people hurt people. And one of the powers of restorative justice is that it is a healing and transformative for survivors as well as offenders. So I'm going to turn to you now, Mr. Dawidoff, and I want to ask you this question. I was hoping you might be able to address some of the lessons that you've learned about generational trauma as you wrote your latest book.
Sure. But I do want to first say that, I hadn't seen the film myself until this week. And what Mr. Williams is saying is absolutely true, that what's so moving about it is that it is a really beautifully made and coherent narrative. But not only that, like all really good true stories, embedded in it is so much truth. And a lot of the truth that is in it is so valuable because a lot of it isn't known. And it's the more difficult thing, I think, when you're making films or you're making books that are true stories, to create a narrative that, especially when you are at the writing phase or filming phase, when you are talking about things that are difficult and a source of pain for a lot of people, and for another groups of people, a source of resistance, things that, let's just be frank, a lot of people don't want to hear about, that you be accurate, because people are always looking for opportunities to be indifferent to some of these subjects that we're talking about. And so it just happens that, my book took me, it was 8 years. I interviewed over 500 people. What I was in effect trying to do was to allow a neighborhood to tell its history, to tell its story in terms of how one single violent event, how a history of a community comes to that event, and what the history and the legacy of difficulties in that community have to say. So it's not, my book isn't only about the issues within the film, but there are a lot of issues that are coincident. And everything that the film says that I know anything about is true. And I think that that is rare. And it's even rarer that there's so much truth in it. And yet it's also so moving and beautifully made. So sorry to go on, but I was just very moved by it. In response to your question, I'll simply say that as I just mentioned, you know, I was thinking about one particular homicide that was, you know, I mean, it wasn't the sort of homicide that we're hearing about in places like Idaho or other vastly nationally reported homicides. It's the much more, if we can use a word that with respect, it's a much more sort of common, just statistically kind of homicide, which is it takes place within the realm of poverty, because it's unavoidable that there's a connection between violence and poverty. And this isn't something that people talk a lot about. It's difficult to generalize about anything, but anybody who spent much time in prisons knows that the relationship between violence and poverty is implicit, and that's generational. And that is a source of some of the things that the film was talking about, which are rage and pain. And with poverty comes all sorts of forms of trauma, right? And in this project, I wanted to understand what the relationship was between generational post-industrial poverty, in other words, a community that had once been established and existed because of work, where the work disappeared, and then for generations, nobody did anything about it. So that the community had been created by people's willingness, desire, eagerness to work, and then the work was taken away and there weren't any options. And once those options departed, there was a loss of purpose for people, and there was a loss of what we might call agency. And once that began to happen, there's a whole spectrum of responses to the trauma of not having those things, which are so, I mean, people talk all the time about the American dream. If you don't feel like you have any access to the American dream, that's painful. And if you feel that you are being excluded, that it isn't just that you don't have access, but there's willful lack of access, that you're in a place where all around you, as is true in so many of our country's cities, New Haven's just one of them, but it's true in Hartford, it's true in Baltimore, it's true in Durham, it's true in Philadelphia, it's true across the heartland, it's true in Los Angeles. There are communities where people feel they have nothing that gives them a sense of hope, and all around them are sources of hope for other people. I thought, it was just my sense that this was a source of trauma, and that might be not alone, but linked to other forms of trauma, might have something to do on the spectrum of behaviors, one of which includes violence. And that's something that seemed to be true. And you can't really prove it scientifically, although some people are trying, but you can see it. And one of the things I would say about violence is that violence, most of the people I met in prisons in the state of Connecticut, and then also through people who have studied these subjects very closely, most of the people who are involved in violence clearly have been exposed to horrific things before they ever committed any act of violence. In other words, the number one predictor of committing violence, just in my experience, but also what the scholarship would say, is exposure to violence. But it's also exposure to other things. There's a guy named Ivan Cusick who spent many years working for the state of Connecticut doing data science, and his great charge was to research why is there so much homicide in Connecticut cities? It's such a wealthy state. How can there be this disparity between cities where there is so much killing and so much poverty, and then the rest of the state where there's so much wealth? And what he discovered in talking to people was just a horrific amount of trauma that people were experiencing early in their lives that preceded acts of violence. First, they were exposed to violence, and people were generally exposed to violence themselves. But also he looked at a group of juveniles, and fully a third of the juveniles were exposed to fetal alcohol and drug syndrome. Another third were exposed just in their youth to either abuse or neglect, and such neglect that they were taken away. These are incredibly painful things to have happen. And I won't go on and on, except to say that the people then that I myself talked to, the narratives of people who end up committing what everyone would say are terrible acts of violence, the narratives of those people, it's no accident that this happens. It accumulates in people. It's fear, it's lack of hope, it's a kind of rage. And if people don't understand the biography of people who commit violence, then they have no understanding of how violence comes to be and really how to overcome it.
really appreciate and thank you for so clearly laying out how intergenerational trauma and violence occurs, and invite, us to consider that generational trauma is generally structural in nature and is a direct reflection of inequality and inequities that are based on race, class, and other identities that are marked as undesirable in our society. So in fact, the conditions that create the container for intergenerational trauma to occur are actually formed through the ways in which the structures, the institutions, and the intersection of those institutions weaving a web of dispossession that creates the container of generational trauma, where whole groups of people are acted upon in traumatic ways by systems and institutions. And so I don't want us to leave this conversation for sure believing that this is a cultural thing, a people thing, a locational thing, and that violence actually is foundational to the American psyche and ways of being. And I think that we're getting clearer about that as we see the ways that violence is enacted outside of what we have traditionally and historically studied to believe, and quite honestly pathologized as a state and place or site of where trauma and violence occurs. And so I throw that into the conversation, even as we pivot now to Dr. Kelly, who I'm curious to hear how you're thinking about and what strategies you've used when you're working to help folks heal from both generational trauma, systemic oppression, and intergenerational trauma that occurs as a maladaptive response to systemic oppression and generational trauma.
Yeah, there was a great quote. Thank you for that question. There was a great quote in the movie, actually, where the woman said, in order to be healed and released, whatever they are suffering from must be named, processed, and understood. And we live in a country where we don't name, process, and understand our history very openly, right? So as someone who works with people who've certainly been impacted by systemic dysfunction, systemic functionality that is violence, right? Working with people to recognize the impacts of the trauma of that, integrating and resolving the most dysfunctional of those impacts, and then working to create a better world, which everyone working to create a better world, that's part of healing. And that all of us have a place in that, whether we've caused harm or not. So for a lot of my work with folks, it's grappling with the ways that our past experiences have colored and shaded our experience today, and the experiences of my people. So whoever my people are, however I identify with that, just watching that those experiences have had an impact on me today. So not only am I learning and living the experiences of everything I've seen, felt, heard, smelled, just viscerally held with my body since the day I was born, but also that of my parents, also that of my neighbors, etc. And the problem is we live in a gaslighting culture. So it's your fault for not succeeding in a system never set up for your success. And, that is a kind of a classic gaslighting. I'm going to put the blame on you for these systems that were never set up to serve people, a lot of people. And separating that personal shame from systemic fallout, right? And really having a real conversation about that, naming it, processing it, understanding it, even as I talk about what are my symptoms as I've survived this my entire life, and how have I maybe caused harm to myself and maybe others in the process of surviving that. And we don't have a space in our culture at all. Where do we grapple with what does it mean to cause harm and hold the ways we're also harmed in that process? And I appreciate Mr. Williams and Mr. Dawidoff are talking about that. After So Bessel van der Kolk says, after you've experienced and or done something unspeakable, how do you learn to trust yourself again? And part of tonight's conversation is really around this like truth and reconciliation. And we can't have truth. We can't, unless we're willing to name where we're coming from as a generation. How do we reconcile that? And a part of that, that's exactly what trauma work is about. So truth of my individual experiences, and then truth in the larger context in which I find myself, and not being treated like I'm at fault. Certainly I have self-agency, certainly I can take responsibility things, but let me just see what are the decisions I made in my life up to this point, and how can that be contextualized in the bigger picture? And when I can do that, when I contextualize the ways I have reacted to the people and the systems around me in the context of colonialism, racism, mass incarceration, access or lack of access to wealth and resources, deindustrialization, right? Living in a community that feels at odds with community leaders, then I can start the process of healing. But as long as I have a personal shame and I'm just sort of dealing with like my hypervigilance, my nightmares, but you know, the typical symptoms that we see as PTSD, we're only going to get so far because we're going to stay in that culture that may devalue our experience of trauma and the larger systems. And I'll say, you know, this is really in the context of incarceration. There's currently not real space in our criminal legal system except for these sort of experimental programs to heal. And most people are coming home, right? So we have a generational trauma, now actually intergenerational, of mass incarceration. How are we expecting our communities to be healthy as people are coming home if we're not working to ensure health for those on the inside, which means naming, processing, understanding, so that we can all move on in this wider community that we have. So I'll leave it at that.
I really appreciate your naming and helping us understand the shape of intergenerational and generational trauma and what the task is at hand. You know, I'm always struck by what I call the 4 horsemen of violence: punishment, isolation, exile, and shame. And shame is really an incredible driver of violence in our nation as we understand it today. So this question, I'm going to pose it to all of our esteemed panelists, but I'll begin with you, Mr. Williams, to respond to what are the barriers that you observe to expanding restorative justice in Connecticut and even across this nation? What are the barriers to expanding restorative justice in Connecticut?
Well, I don't actually know that I can speak specifically to Connecticut. And I do want to say that show some appreciation for what both Mr. Dawidoff and Kelly have spoken. We go to prison because of the traumas and inability to process traumas and things that we have, and it ends up resulting in really, you know, negative behavior. And then people come home and they go, they sit, they stew there, and then they're released. And by some kind of osmosis, there's supposed to be some kind of transformation, right? And then when you're talking about trying to heal like our communities, the community itself has a huge suffering that has to be addressed. And this is, you know, I think in some ways I may be furthering what Kelly, I don't want to use your name or whatever, but, you know, I'll just say Kelly. And what Kelly was saying was that the injuries is also not just us coming home, but we're bringing those injuries to the community, right? And then what work now has to be done on a communal level as well, because fathers have been missing, because husbands have been, you know, gone, and none of this is to, excuse any of the behavior by any means. And we also know where there is individual accountability, there's also a whole lot of systemic accountability. And I think we have to start to look in all of these different areas. And back to the subject of what you started with, Merle, is a lot of local people have been doing a lot of good stuff, and they haven't been getting the resources that they need to further what they're doing. I think we'll find that if we really look at a lot more of the on the micro level, a lot more of the what local communities are doing, I think we'll find a lot of the answers that we need. So I don't necessarily know that we need to go around trying to reinvent the wheel. I think we have the answers that we have, and some of these answers are very effective on smaller levels, but they haven't been able to grow or build on a bigger level because they don't have the resources or funding that they need to be able to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Dawidoff?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I noticed right away is that the community that I was writing about, when there was full employment and decent salaries, one of the ironies is that a lot of that at first was created by a carriage factory, but later the big industry was a gun factory. And one of the great ironies of my project was that when the gun factory was thriving and providing employment for people in the neighborhood, in the working class neighborhood that was, that was the source of my project, there wasn't any violence. People didn't even lock their doors. And it's the same people, just the next generation, then when the work went away, the trouble came. And so what Mr. Williams is saying is absolutely right, that, there's no real difference except circumstances and opportunity and some of the many things that he's talking about. But what are some of the barriers? The barriers are many, and the barriers are complicated. One of the things Mr. Williams was just mentioning is that there are a great many people who are well-intended people from all over communities who've been working very hard in addressing the many facets of the very complicated story that leads to, we should also emphasize that what expresses as violence in some people is on a spectrum. People respond to traumas in many different ways. Some people respond to these sorts of traumas in ways that are, one might even, sex or friendship or love or sports or exercise or reading. Other people respond to them with alcohol or drugs, or, there are many different kinds of behaviors. And violence is incredibly traumatic, both for the people who commit violence and for the people who are around it. It's a little bit like a shark attack, right? In a beach community, if there's a shark attack, it doesn't take many, it doesn't take many sightings of a shark or many episodes of it for many, many people around to be traumatized. A whole community, nobody's going to go in the water, right? Violence is like that too. But it's such a complicated question that you're asking. And I think I would just say very, sort of almost in ellipses, I'll say a few things. One thing I'll say is that, sure, there are many people who know these things, but if these problems were easy to solve, they would have already been solved. That these problems persist is because they're difficult, and big problems require big institutions, I think, to help solve them. So if governments, if big companies, if big universities with great research capacity and large endowments, if those sorts of places aren't committed to helping, then big problems like this can't be solved, because mass incarceration has the word mass in front of it. And a lot of people have heard a lot about mass incarceration. What people have heard a lot less about is mass reentry. So what Mr. Williams is saying, absolutely true. I think the number is 96% of people who are presently incarcerated, who are in prisons, are going to come out. And the people who are coming out, whatever the weight of life was that brought them to prison, and what it takes to succeed in prison, I think Mr. Williams might agree, whatever it takes to succeed in prison, it's its own environment. And the things that typically, not always, he was in a pretty unique situation, I think, from most of the people, different from most of the people I've met who spent a lot of time in prison. Whatever it takes to succeed in prison generally doesn't, with exceptions, but generally isn't what it takes to succeed once you come out. And when you come out, your experience of the world, if you went in when you were 16 or 18 years old, you're still 16 or 18 years old in terms of experience outside prison. These are huge adjustments. I spent a year sitting in a federal reentry court, watching great groups of people with all the goodwill in the world, trying to help a bunch of people who come out of long terms in prison, adjust to the world and move forward. It's incredibly difficult. And it isn't difficult because any of those people didn't want to succeed. They wanted it so much. It was heartbreaking to watch how much people wanted it. But stacked against them was, again, whatever brought them there in the first place, then the experience of being in a place that, I mean, let's face it, what's prison designed to be? A place you don't want to go to, right? So you come out of the place where nobody's supposed to want to go to. And here you are in the world and excuse my language, but it's like still much of society says you fucked up, fix yourself, right? And that's impossible. In fact, these are people who need more help than anybody else because they're more behind because of where they've been. And I think that requires a great deal of empathy and understanding. And I would just say one more thing I think is really important to know is that if nobody does things that they don't feel are in their own self-interest, that's just generally the way of mankind. And it has to be that it's people understand that the success of people who are leaving prison, the success of people who've experienced and participated in violence is in society's interests. In other words, the programs that are described in the film, the hopefulness for people coming out and providing, sort of a flourishing life for themselves, a flourishing life for their family and their community, that this is to society's benefit, and if you can't convince people that it's in their interests, that their community will be a better place if they subscribe to some of the things that the film's advocating for, then it isn't going to work. I mean, so it takes not only advocacy, but it takes persuasion with people who maybe are initially as reluctant as the woman in the film was. But as the film shows, it can be done. It just takes, it takes work. It takes that's why I talk about big institutions. It's like President Obama, right? When President Obama would talk about problems, he would say, well, the problems that come to me are the problems that nobody else could solve. That's why I'm the president, right? It's the last stop for problems. And I feel as though post-industrial poverty and post-industrial violence, that these are things that are last stop problems, and big problems of mass incarceration, everything that creates it, problems of mass reentry, these are big last stop problems. And unless big institutions participate in them, then I don't think that it's possible to solve them in the way that we would want them to be solved, and certainly with the facility and ease. And I think it's also in those institutions' interest. New Haven, Connecticut's is a better place for Yale to be when the city is thriving. It's just historically been a terrible look for that there is this incredibly wealthy, well-endowed university surrounded by generational poverty. That's not a good thing, and that it's solvable and fixable. And just as Mr. Williams said, it is possible to solve and to fix, but it takes a lot of effort, and it takes the participation of big institutions. It just needs to be done. And just as, one of the things I liked so much about the film is that it shows someone actually in transformation. It shows a woman who felt very strongly one way. And the film shows you so beautifully how somebody can come to see things differently. And I feel it's just in cities like New Haven and all across the country, it's division. If people understand one another with more sensitivity and more acuity, then these problems are much more easy to solve.
Can I jump in and say, I want to say first, I appreciate everything you said, and I want to make a slight clarification. That my initial time in prison was not San Quentin. I was in war zones. I did shoot time. I've been through the hell that prison is. So the point that I think is important to make a distinction is that we made San Quentin like that. Like the community, we had a warden who saw the benefit. We had a couple of staff, because a lot was resistance, but we had a couple of staff who saw the benefit. We had community people willing to come in because they saw the benefit. And we had a prison population. Every single program that you see inside of San Quentin, especially the early on programs, was initiated by somebody who was incarcerated there, who reached out to the community, and the community responded overwhelmingly because of where we at in the location and who people are. And then the few staff that we had went along, and we had a warden that pushed the line on it. And so that is the restorative process that came, and San Quentin turned into what it is. Because San Quentin used to be, you know, there's a section of San Quentin they used to call, notorious for stabbings, they used to call Blood Alley, right? And so San Quentin turned into this place. You know, there's some problems happening in there now, and things are changing. A lot of the old heads are leaving and stuff is happening, but a lot of us are home. A lot of us are coming home. But the emphasis that I want to put on is that what has to be done is that it is truly restorative in the sense of that all of the stakeholders have to be at the table. Like, you know, I walk into a lot of rooms, even when I came home, and I would hear people saying, well, we need to do this in the prison system, and they would be saying stuff. And then I raised my hand and I was like, well, who here has been incarcerated? And then nobody raised their hand. And I'm like, y'all trying to develop a plan, but you're not even talking to the people that you say you're trying to help, right? And so in order for us to really fix our community, big corporations, they give us the resources and stop doing the damage that causes stuff in the first place. And then allow us, we have to have a seat at the table. The community, representatives from every walk in the community have to be at the table. If I'm going to talk about making a cure for homelessness and I don't have a homeless person at the table, then it's just not right, you know? And I'm not saying you were saying that. I appreciate what you said. I just wanted to make the clarification that one, you know, my time started off rough, man. Like it started off really, really rough. And that San Quentin was a place that was built and that was created because the population of every race, color, and creed saw the benefit of us having to put down the weapons, and the guards, certain guards saw, well, I need to help this out because this is the stuff that's coming back to my community, and I need to try. And then professors and college people came in, and we built something that allowed the community to be what it is and what it turned to, that allowed that program to thrive, you know, in the way that it did, even to the point to when Catherine came in, the early days, you know, I appointed myself the prison population local filmmaker, and my job was to go out and interface with every camera that came up in that place, because I wanted to know, were you gonna actually tell our true story, the story we wanted told, or was you gonna come in here and do like Lockup did, or do like National Geographic did, and come in and make us look like buffoons and make me still look like the 17-year-old who committed the crime when you're talking to a 50-year-old grandfather now, you know? So, yeah, I just think that was important to say. And I know that we're on the same page, and at some point I know that we're speaking the same language, and this is what's beautiful about this dialogue, is that we all have to be at the table. We all have to be able to contribute to the conversation, or else we miss important factors.
I really appreciate your follow-up to that, Mr. Williams, and really underscoring that institutions and structures are designed to serve the purpose. I mean, lest we all forget why prisons, why policing was even constructed. It was designed for a certain purpose. And so we want to make sure that we're also naming, right, the responsibility of institutions to transform and to participate, but also the tension that lies there within that request that folks are making. Dr. Kelly, Do you want to comment on this, or should we move to another question? Do you have some burning thoughts on this question here around expanding restorative justice in Connecticut or country?
Yeah, I just have a few things to add. I think the biggest barrier to expanding is culture. That's true on a statewide level, and that's true nationally. It's culture of punishment and penance that are entrenched since the founding of our country. And it's this very individual outlook, right? That's also a part of our culture. It's a personal responsibility to succeed. It's a personal responsibility to heal. It's a personal responsibility, not a collective responsibility, to take care of each other and make sure that we all are healthier and that we're all succeeding in our communities across, where do our communities, because they're so segregated too, we're not taking responsibility for all of our communities. Like, as a resident of New Haven, I know there's a lot of residents of New Haven that are only thinking about their neighborhood, right? And not thinking about the larger communities. I think it's easier in our culture to disappear people into boxes than to grapple with our dysfunction as a culture. The ways that the violence shows up in our culture, it's easier to disappear people after the fact than try to step in and figure out those are clearly symptoms of social problems. But it's easier, it's more expensive to lock people in boxes, but it's easier for people to think about, you did wrong individually, you go away, rather than what have we as a collective community done wrong that this is happening in the first place. And again, that generational trauma, right? Like, industry leaves, and out of helplessness, out of a lack of resources, out of feeling forgotten about and not prioritized, then all of this intergenerational trauma now starts to arrive, and it's very expensive, and it creates a lot more dysfunction in our communities, putting people in boxes rather than trying to deal with why this is happening in the first place. Here in Connecticut, I think there's some very well-meaning people across systems who want things to change, but everyone seems to feel like their hands are tied in these systems. They're so entrenched. So I meet people within DOC and they're like, this is a wonderful program. It should really be expanded, but then they don't talk out loud like that across that system because they want to keep their head down, keep jobs. Like, that's real, right? Like an economic sustainability for self and my paycheck. And because we don't promote these programs that are doing very cool things across Connecticut, and we don't fund them appropriately, we don't, give the resources that we could as a community, then, people who are coming out of prison less healthy than they went in, and then we wonder why it's not working out for our communities. There's two excellent programs here in Connecticut at Cheshire Correctional Institution and York Correctional Institution that are really built around restorative justice models. And it has been disheartening in the ways that they haven't been supported on a statewide level, and why they've remained 2 units rather than being built wider. Because the men who have stepped up as mentors and mentees, and the women who stepped up as mentors and mentees, have done incredible work in building this community together. But a lot of us in Connecticut don't know about it. And so we don't have that example of what could be happening, how we could be doing this differently. And I guess the last thing about the bureaucracy is just that right now, when we think about incarceration, it's all about control. Actually, when we think about schools, right, it's all about controlling of behavior. And you really have to relinquish control when we're co-creating a process of truth and reconciliation, which is what restorative justice is. Whether it's in a trial moment or whatever would be instead of a trial, or when it's in a prison setting, there's a letting go of a little bit of control and allowing people their whole humanity to participate in a process like this. So we have a lot of short-term control, disappearing people that feel dangerous in our communities, but it's really to our long-term detriment. And I think that really acts as a barrier to expanding these programs in our state.
Something I've just never understood is why the punishment isn't having to go to a place where you don't want to go, just being in effect removed. And I've never understood why from day one, once you are there, the focus on your existence there isn't on your future, because you're on your future when you return. It just makes more sense for everyone. The number one predictor of lack of recidivism in Connecticut is anybody who just signs up to get their high school equivalency degree. much less enters either, gets a GED or enters, the few college programs that exist in prisons. It's just the more of an informed path forward that people have who are placed in such places, the better it is for them. But then it's also just the return for society, for people who are skeptical, is undeniable. And I just think it's I thought over and over again, as I worked on my project, it just seemed such a self-defeating model to be so punitive about everything when the obvious punitive component that exists is being removed from life, from your freedom. But once you're removed, prepare so that it doesn't happen again. Make life better for individuals, which just makes life better for everybody else around. In Connecticut, you're asking about Connecticut. I would just also say that Connecticut's a really good place to do these things because it's small. Connecticut's always been a representative place because it's small, but there have been a lot of ideas and a lot of people who are engaged in programs and things. And also there are pluses and minuses to this, but with prisons, as with police departments and things, a lot of it is dependent upon leadership. And leaders in these organizations aren't uniform. They're not monochromatic in what they do. You have the opportunity to see how different forms of leadership and different kinds of inspiration in leadership can create different kinds of change. But I think what Dr. Kelly is saying is also true, that even well-intended people, there is a kind of what we might even call a systemic reluctance. And that's just it. The frustrating self-defeatingness of all this is just, it's sometimes just, it's really overwhelming, right?
And what I would invite, actually, folks who are out there listening to this conversation who share your point of view, is to consider the historical purpose of prisons in this nation, particularly post the enslavement period. That the design of prison is in fact to control and to disappear people, and to rid, certain folks from being able to participate and, dare I say, even compete, right, for the American dream. And I think it becomes really important for us as we think about restorative justice or transformative justice or any form of justice, that we grapple with the history and the legacy and the intention behind the institutions that have been formed, and what the tension remains for those institutions to actually do something about some of the outcomes that we see today. And of course, we know that violence is not segregated to particular communities or to class realities. We know that there is a different kind of interpersonal violence that occurs in those spaces. But as a nation that is now dealing with mass violence on an everyday level, that's coming out of pockets that have historically not experienced direct impact of systemic oppression, like racism, like poverty, right? We know that it's the violence. It is the violence and the relationship to violence and the gaslighting that you mentioned, Dr. Kelly, about how we talk about violence, that some violence is glorified, some violence is not, some violence is necessary to procure things, land, resources, and other violence is not acceptable. And so there's an invitation in the restorative process to really lean into the clarity. And if anyone is curious about the prison system and why it exists and how it's come to mass incarceration, just watch Ava DuVernay's 13th. Tells you everything you need to know about why we have mass incarceration today. So I am going to just ask our panelists, with the recognition that we are coming to the close of our panel discussion, to respond with the necessary clarity and brevity to this final question. And that is, what is one thing each of us who's here on this call right now listening in can do to begin to change the current justice system into one that is restorative or even possibly transformative. And I'll start back with you, Dr. Kelly, and we'll work our way back to Mr. Dawidoff and then Mr.
So I would say ask for it, demand it, right? That the way we get any kind of policy changes is when our residents of our state, of our cities, ask for it and demand it. Why aren't my tax dollars being used to fund practices that actually heal our communities, that bring people back into our communities stronger? And if they are used to start programs like the Worth Unit at York, like the True Unit at Cheshire, make sure they continue to be well resourced so that they're successful. Yeah, I mean, it really takes us asking and demanding for these things. And actually not just in our prisons, in our DCF systems, in our school systems, in our healthcare systems, that we are bringing these practices across the board so that we're not waiting until people have lost their freedom to be able to engage in these practices or who have been really harmed to engage in these practices.
Thank you. Mr. Dawidoff.
I just think I mean, you're asking, I think, on a practical level, and I would say that people generally, when there are problems, that the portal for people's participation in problems is to bring what they're good at. And whatever you're really good at, think about how whatever it is that you're good at can, and with recognition of some of the subjects and problems that we're talking about, think about what you can bring to it that would be helpful to something that can seem just like such a massive problem, nothing could be done, but do as much as you can on an individual level in an informed way. The other thing I would just say generally is that it works better in every facet of life with problems that resemble this extreme problem, but all the other problems that I think, to me anyway, are a part of it, that it's a complex series of many different components that make up these problems, that violence isn't just violence, it's made up of many, many kinds of causes. And I think that the best way for people to begin on an individual level to understand them and to begin to overcome them is to listen, is to have curiosity about the experiences of other people, take the time to come to know other people. And that's true for police officers, that's true for teachers. I think that that's true for writers and journalists. I think that that's true for doctors. I think it's just true in every walk of life, that the better you know your neighbors, the better you know people who you are associated with, the more curiosity you have. That it was just as Mr. Williams is saying earlier, that when there are problems, you should go towards problems with modesty and a sort of humility. You should listen. And as you listen, then that informs how you can act.
I love it. I love it. In addition to what's already been said, which I agree with wholeheartedly, we have to change the narrative, right? Like, I know somebody put, Courageous Deb, somebody put in there that one of the wardens said their incarceration is punishment. It is not our job as correctional professionals to further punishment, but like, what is being done to change the narrative of what is public safety, for example? We began to challenge the system about what does public safety mean? You just lock somebody up and throw away the key, and then 10, 20 years later, when they're done, you unlock the door and say, you've been punished, therefore you should be penitent by now, right? No. Public safety means that if you keep me locked up for 10 or 20 years and don't provide any resources for me to better my mind state, better my emotional state, better my financial state, to uplift myself when I'm come back home into the community, then all you've done is sweep the dust underneath the carpet. You haven't actually cleaned anything, right? So we have to begin to change the narrative around what it means for us to re-enter back into society. What does it mean for communities. Get with local people who are doing the work. And like Mr. Dawidoff said, listen to them, listen to what they have to say and get behind them, and then start to challenge people in these positions about these narratives that have proven not to work over the past 40 years.
Thank you all so very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists that are with us today. Dr. Amber Kelly, Mr. Nicholas Dawidoff, and Mr. Troy Williams.